Check. Am I audible to everyone? Those of you who are logged into the session, please let me know if everything is fine. Let me once check it at my end as well. All right, great. So let's start with today's class. In our series of classes, we've had we've had three classes with me. The our sections from different points of views. The first class we did was an introductory class. I discussed not the RC part. Everyone knows how RCs look like and what is generally asked in RCs. In the first class, I discussed the verbal ability, the critical reasoning aspect of it, and the grammar and vocab part. I discussed how to practice those questions, where to practice them from, how to practice previous year papers, so on and so forth. Right. In today's class, we'll continue with the logical reasoning section. In the prior class, like I said, in class number 2, we have covered RC and poems. I also mentioned how one should go about deciding whether the poem in the exam should be attempted or not. Uh, which kind of poem to attempt versus which kind of poem not to attempt. RCs also I discussed one short RC. Uh, Today's class will focus on the parajumble question type and the critical reasoning question type. So let's start with today's class. All right. This is the slide that I'd shown you in the first class as well. We aren't discussing the RCs or poems today. We're discussing the fill in the blank, the critical reasoning and parajumble question type. If you look at the critical reasoning number 5 question and the parajumble, which is question number 2. These are the two questions we would be discussing. All right. In critical reasoning, usually we are looking at three ways to ask questions. One is an inference question, which is one of the more common critical reasoning questions. There is assumption question, and there are strengthening or weakening question types, which are related to the author's argument. All right. Uh, and then we have the parajumble question type. All right. We had seen these critical reasoning question types before. There are different ways to ask these questions, which would be, if you look at this, based on the above information, which of the following must be true? So this is inference. Best concluded inference. Best describes the relationship of the first paragraph to the second paragraph. We can call this main point or structure of the passage related. Best summarizes the above passage. So main point structure of the passage related to that. What could the author be trying to prove? So inference would be the most meaningful conclusion. Inference most seriously weakens. So this is about the main point of the author. Argument of the author needs to be weakened. The argument of the author needs to be strengthened, so on and so forth. And which of the following can be best inferred? This is an outright inference question. These are some of the ways of asking these type of critical reasoning questions. If you Most of you will realize that this is basically what an RC does, especially in XAT as well. These are the kind of questions we see. So the question types are similar. What changes is the length of the information we have to go through to answer these questions. In an RC, it could be like 300, 350 words, but here usually somewhere around 200 words or 150 words. Okay. We know that throughout my CAT classes also, I've discussed this idea. We are expected to have the ability to simplify and evaluate any written information without having prior context. Meaning there is no title, there's no subtitle, right? So since these are not there, we need to construct that along the way, right? And I've mentioned the approach that we should be taking is to reduce any passage to about a certain topic, the author says something specific. So and by the way, these blanks A and B are to be filled. this I'll discuss that blanks A and B are to be filled using the author's words, right? So actual words from the passage. And blank A will give us the topic, and blank B will give us what the author is saying, what about the topic specific. All right, just one moment. Where to practice critical reasoning questions from? I'll cover that aspect as well. So this is what is expected out of us: is filling blanks A and B for any written material. That applies to this question type, which we will start with. I want to get over with two parajumble questions, right? So figuring out the blank A and blank B, which will give us put together, which will give us the main point of the author. Figuring out the main point of the author is important for every question type. Uh, in a parajumble question, it applies in such a way. Now, in the prior classes, I'll tell you as in jumble questions. In the prior class, we had discussed your specifically RCs and poems. And in those also, even for the poem, there's a way to figure out what the author is essentially trying to say. It's much harder, like I told you. In an RC, you can do it over 500 words. But for parajumbles, there's a few things we have to keep in mind. One is the method that we have to apply, and we have to be really methodical while solving these questions. Uh, the method, if we follow, it increases our overall accuracy for all the VALR question types, but especially for parajumble questions. I personally feel parajumble can be one of the most difficult topics. Usually, it's slightly harder in CAT because it's a TIT type. In XAT, fortunately, they give us these options. But when to use the options, at what stage do I start looking at the options, how to utilize them such that I can solve it fast and be accurate. This boils down to method. All right. So I'll like, detail a certain method. I've discussed this slightly in the first class. I just want all of you to follow that solving method. And Chaitali, I'll discuss where critical reasoning questions can be practiced from. But just to your point, for critical reasoning questions and parajumble questions, the method that you have to apply is as important. So write down the method, make sure that each time you're practicing the questions that we discussed in the next 10 odd days that you've left, uh, make sure that you practice them. So a parajumble could be for 3 sentences, 4 sentences, 5 sentences, 6 sentences. It really matters. That parajumble usually is 5 sentences. Okay. So with each sentence that you add, you're basically adding more information. So it's going to take up time. But if there is more information, there is more clarity about the topic, and there is more clarity about what the author is trying to say. So, in a paradoxical way, the more information you give, the better we can actually construct this paragraph. Okay. So that means we have to go through the information in a way where we can start ordering it in a certain way. Correct? So the first thing to remember, this order that you see from here, start, Surabhi is still content, is the worst possible order to read these sentences in. It's the worst possible order because the examiner has chosen or designed that order. So if we actually read in this fashion, odds are we are going to end up thinking something else for this. What is the author trying to say about the topic? In short, the image of the passage that we'll create in our minds would be skewed if we read from 1 to 5. So this is one of the biggest or and the easiest thing to do from your perspective to increase your accuracy for bad questions is to read from 5 to 1. All right. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's actually going to improve your accuracy by a big margin. Then, while reading, of course, the first time you read the sentence, you're just trying to understand what overall the author is trying to say. But each sentence, when you read about the second time, this will apply to each sentence. Suppose you have to read sentence twice. Some sentences rarely can be done in one reading. Some sentences require, maybe more readings than two. But after the first reading, what I expect you to do is two things. One is look for some clues in these sentences. Clues can be of two kinds. We want to make a mandatory pair for starters. Mandatory basically means compulsory. This is just a fancy way of saying that there are two sentences which are connected in such a way. Let's say sentence 4 and sentence 2. This is the only possible order. This is a mandatory pair. This is the only possible order. There cannot be a gap between the two. There cannot be any number between the two, so on and so forth. 4 2 is the only possible order. So we want to develop this sort of a pair at some stage in our solving process, right? So we look for these clues. Now these clues can be of two kinds. One is a sentence connection. Maybe there is a word 5 which connects with sentence 2 in such a way that you know that 2 5 has to be the order. There cannot be no other way, right? Now this connection could be a syntax or sentence connection type of a thing, right? Syntax is basically how sentences are put together, rules to put sentences together or to put words together in such a way that logical sentence is formed. So that's what syntax means. So there could either be a syntactical reason or just some overlap of information, which is the other way, which is the topic way or thematic way. Topic. So you see some discussion in sentence 1 which is talking about a certain topic, and you notice that similar discussion in sentence 4. Then you realize that 1 4 is the only possible. Now, these connections I want you to build after you go through all the sentences and not before. Don't start making these mandatory pairs too soon. All right? Because if we make an incorrect connection, we might end up making the wrong pair. So we need to look at all the provided information. So first read 5 to 1. Look for such clues like a clue like this or a clue like this, and then you can make your pair. Now, what is going to happen is when you form some pair like this or some pair like this, a part of the author point is going to get revealed to you. Clearly, the author is going to speak about some specific topic here, right? That topic also we'll discover as we read from 5 to 1. But when we have a certain pair, we're going to get what the author specifically wanted to say about the topic or a part of that, right? So here we have partial main point of the author as well. All right. Now, this is the stage. This is slightly different than those of you who have done parajumbles for CAT, where we solve them in a TITA type of a way. Since we have a particular pair, then what you do is you go through those options and only now realize this. I'm making the pair only after I've gone through all the sentences. And therefore, I'm very sure about this mandatory pair. I know that 1 4 has to be a sequence, and I know that 2 5 has to be a part of the sequence. So if I make these, then I can confidently start searching through options. And I don't really need to make the complete sequence, right? So this is why I say the XAT parajumble is slightly easier than the CAT parajumble because we can have this part sequence and start looking through these. Mind you, don't immediately, if you see B has 1 4, right, and 2 5 also, and let's say it's 1 4 3 2 5, don't immediately jump to a conclusion at this stage and mark that as your answer. It'll take only 20 seconds, and important 20 seconds because your accuracy can be 100% for the question then. Just quickly go through the sentences, not all the sentences also. You'll have made these, this will be fixed. What I wanted to look at is this transition between 4 to 3 and 3 to 2 and whether this makes complete sense or not. This will, 20 seconds is the upper limit. Usually most students would be able to do this much faster. So at this stage, once you're sure of this, then mark B as your answer. Uh, Strengthening, weakening questions are really interesting. I'll discuss those questions shortly. All right. So just let me clarify the method once. Read from 5 to 1. Make at least one mandatory pair. Let's say 4 2 is your mandatory pair. Start by looking for that in the options. Once you have that option, just go and confirm if the main point of the author makes sense according to what you've read, and then mark that as your sequence. All right, so let's try and solve two questions really quickly. Let's get started with the first one. Please follow the method, type in your answers when you're ready. 2 minutes would be a good solving time for a question like this. Hopefully faster, but let's put two as the upper. All right. Some of you have typed in your answers. So let me start with this. Which of the following combination is the most logically ordered? Uh, no mention of coherence. Cat always mentions that we have to arrange these in a coherent way. Let's start with sentence T. Social media influencers are used for dissemination of content. Uh, Notice what I didn't say while developing the method of solving these questions. Don't look for opening or closing statements. Right? The reason why I'm very clear that you shouldn't do that is because examiners know this. They often know that we, we have a tendency, natural tendency to think in this fashion that, oh, this sounds like opening statement, closing statement. So they'll capitalize on that by placing a statement like this. Uh, if you look at it as a standalone statement, it looks like the opening of some paragraph, right? So try not to use that. Social media influences are used for the dissemination of content. So we simply pick up on this topic of discussion here, which is social media influencers used to spread content. Nothing specific. Political advertising on social media comes in many forms and remains under examined in India. The sentence S is being very categorical about political advertising on social media. So we can notice that there is some overlap here, uh, and remains under examined here is where the author is becoming specific. All right, let's look at sentence R. Political campaigns pay social media companies to promote their content. Again, this social media overlap we notice in all the three sentences. We can say the topic would involve most probably the word social media. So in terms of our blank, we know that about topic A, A probably includes the words social media, most probably includes. Political campaigns pay social media companies to promote their content. Other thing which may be included is political campaign or political advertising in the topic of the author in India. Now, this specificity was useful because you notice here we are talking categorically about India, under examined in India. So this could be an overlap, and maybe not right now, but later, maybe that SQ could be some kind of a sequence. Or if not a direct sequence, the author may head from sentence S to sentence Q. Uh, in India, the report suggests that WhatsApp is the primary tool for the dissemination of political. So clearly, dissemination of political communication on social media is blank A, correct? So if you notice, while I'm reading up towards sentence P, I'm building up the main point of the author, like a rough idea of the main point of the author, and I'm looking for information such that I can make some kind of mandatory pair. All right. Then sentence P, Surbhi's Instagram profile has 1.4 million followers. It's filled with pictures of her posing in different settings. One thing that I told you about in the reading comprehension class and in the poem class, if you're reading any information in any of these aptitude exams for verbal section, always notice the author giving examples. Some examples are given outright, for example, bolke. Some examples are given, just simply conversationally sort of. Here, this Surbi line is an example, right? And it's an example of whatever is being said in sentence P, which is social media influencers are used. For example, Surbi's Instagram profile, etc. Right? If you notice, it's such an easy pair to make that it's actually present in four options. EP as a pair is present in four options, right? Okay. So now that we have figured out that clearly TP would be one of the pairs, and we know TP is an example of social media influences used for dissemination of content, but we know dissemination of what content? It's supposed to be of political content, right? Now we want to also proceed. The one is TP is a pair. We also want to proceed from remains under examined in India, slightly more examination in sentence Q given by the author of this uh, passage, right? So SQ is something that we're looking for, if not a direct pair, but to proceed from sentence S to sentence Q. Political campaigns pay social media companies to promote their content. Paying social media companies to promote their content. An example of that would be WhatsApp is the primary tool, right? So we might have SRQ TP. So in this case, we clearly have come up with the sequence, right? SRQTP. But even if you did not have this complete thing, you could start looking with this first, and then you can. The other way to actually come up with the right answer, or to be really accurate for this question type, is then start eliminating each. Read it in this order, read it in this order, read it in this order, and then you can eliminate your way to the right answer, which is option C. uh, it's more time consuming to that elimination way, and therefore I suggest that students don't do that. It can take up to 3 minutes. 3 minutes is not worthwhile in terms of investment of time for this question. Okay. If you notice this overlap of information I just marked for you, political advertising on social media companies comes in many forms. Uh, Social media companies are paid. WhatsApp is the primary tool. An example of a social media company which is being used. Influencers such as Survey are used for dissemination of content. So SRQTP is the right answer. Let's try and solve one more question really quickly. The difference between a XAT parajumble and a CAT parajumble is usually the XAT parajumbles are longer. You can expect this length of information. All right, please start with this. I'll discuss the strengthening weakening question type also. I noticed there are some questions about it. This is a 2019 question. Uh, All right, let's start with this. Now, the more and more you solve these questions, parajumble questions can be practiced from most of our sources, by the way, are going to remain the same from the prior classes. So, really good for us to solve CAT papers from these years. These papers actually have options. The questions are really similar to this parajumble that you see, and previous years that papers. If you solve enough questions, you'll know that if there is a sentence with quotes, and we can quickly scan and notice that none of the other sentences have any quotations. I'm not really going to read that sentence. Like, I'm not going to read it first. If this sentence was placed here, also it would be the same thing, because it's probably going to be spoken by someone before or after. It'll have some frame of reference. I can look for that frame of reference in the remaining sentences. All right. Uh, so, sentence five we'll put aside. Archaeologists who used to assume that animals such as cows and goats were mainly used for meat uh, early in their domestication history are thus forced to admit that humans might have been using animals for dairy quite early. So, archaeologists who used to assume that they were mainly used for meat, animals were mainly used for meat, and this is a very important proof, thus forced. So that tells that there has been something that some either evidence or something conclusive that changed their minds, right? So the word thus is the most important proof. Uh, let's look at sentence three. Fresh milk couldn't be kept for long without going bad. Cheese, on the other hand, could be stored for months at a time. So this is saying that cheese has a longer storage life or this shelf life. Two says in many Neolithic sites, researchers unearthed cone-shaped clay vessels known as raita, maybe, with four legs on the bottom and a round opening on the side. So some clay vessels are described for us. They subjected the residues. Okay, the residues, the clue here, just like thus, an equally important clue is they subjected the residue. Right? Now they could refer to two groups possibly from we don't know if there's any group in sentence five because I just said that I would read it first. Uh, they would refer to either researchers or archaeologists. But since we know this has the word thus, so the evidence finding has taken place before, correct? So it's not going to be archaeology. They is probably going to refer to researchers. So now we are done reading the remaining four sentences. I don't still want to look for sentence five because I'll find who's quoting it later. I haven't read the content. I'm just trying to show how I would solve it. So I'm now going to start looking for 2-1, right? And you notice that it's a relatively easy thing. So they've given it in four sentences, four options. So now that I have 2-1, 2-1 tells me that they look for residues uh, and to identify the structure and composition that vessels were used to store cheese, right? So sentence one talks about storing cheese. Cheese could be stored for months at a time. So now I'm going to start looking for 213, correct? So 213 is present in two options, here and here, correct? Now I already told you that there is no point starting with sentence four because it has the word thus. This needs some, this conversion in mindset requires some evidence, correct? So 4 ke pehle there has to be something that takes place in the remaining sentences. So option B has 213 and option D has 213. B is not possible because it's placing sentence 4 ahead of 213, right? It's coming before 213. We want to go with an option like D, but before I go with option D, I want to read it and then figure out if it makes sense. I already know what 213 is, so I'm not going to bother reading 213. I'm going to read sentence 5 after that. If you kill one cow, you eat meat for about a week. Uh, but by milking the animals, the farmer would be spreading the food grain. This is being spoken by the researchers who have found the clay vessels, right? According to our sequence, this is being spoken by the researchers who have found these vessels to store cheese, and cheese could be stored for months at a time. So by milking the animals, the farmer would be spreading the food gain. So 21354 makes complete sense, and we mark B as the answer. All right. So I know, like, actually, I have to move along, and there's a lot of information that I have to go through. What I want all of you to remember is go pause the video and you can, rewatch my explanation. But go about solving these questions, all the questions we'll discuss today in a methodic fashion. Um, Let me start with critical reasoning and strengthening weakening questions. In weakening questions, can I follow this procedure, understand the idea, eliminate options which are all right? Not necessarily. That method has one or two flaws with it. Let's say which of the following statements, if true, weakens the logic of the above passage, which of the following strengthens the logic of the above passage. Let me describe the method, and then you can talk about what method you would prefer to use. So first is that this question here is asking us about the logic of the above passage. This could be the argument made by the author. This could be the author's opinion. This could be the author's conclusion, author's hypothesis, right? Whatever has been stated here, okay, you want to, someone has asked a doubt, everyone can read that doubt. It's a very relevant doubt, how to solve strengthening, weakening questions. Chaitanya has asked the doubt. The problem with that is it's not important for me to just know the main point of the author. Most of the times, the main point would be similar to this, but I should know the exact words which indicate the main point of the author or which indicate the logic of the author. When I read, I want to figure out the exact words. Now, why do I want to figure out the exact words? Because suppose, let's say, the logic of this passage, for example, let's say, stated that eating, researchers found that eating consumption of more protein led to uh, better bone density in mammals, something like that, right? So the logic is that consumption of more protein would cause more bone density. Now, if I asked you to weaken that logic, it's very important to know what the words are so that you can say to weaken it, it would be the opposite. So the logic I gave you was more protein leads to more bone density in mammals. Correct? This was the logic. If I expect you to weaken this, then you want to find an option which will categorically tell you that more protein does not does not lead to more bone density, right? Something. And the words if true are sometimes mentioned, sometimes not mentioned, but they're always present in the options. The words if true are talking about the option, right? They're sometimes mentioned, sometimes not mentioned. And the reason why they're always true is about the options because they'll give us four or five random options which are not present in the passage. But we want to take those options as true facts and we want to see if they'll strengthen the author's argument or weaken the author's argument. For example, I'll tell you our logic here is more protein leads to more bone density in mammals. We want to weaken that logic. We want to find an option which will say more protein does not lead to more bone density. Let's say there was option C which said uh, there's some species of fish found in some region. Researchers found that when those fish consume more protein, the density of their cartilage actually decreased. Correct? So the opposite happened based on the information in sentence C. So we take that information to be true, and then we realize that that true information is actually weakening this logic, and that's how we identify the right option. The other option could be sentence D would strengthen the logic. It would say that we found that when ungulates consumed a certain kind of grass, the protein density increased, their bone density increased because that type of grass has more protein, right? So D would strengthen the argument. Or there is the other possibility is option E, which says that drinking water does not change the bone density of mammals. So option E is unrelated. There are three types of options that can be created. The unrelated option is never asked to us. The question is always going to be about weakening or strength. All right. So I hope the method is clear to everyone. As I said again, please pause later and rewatch if needed. Let's get started with the first question. First step is for you to identify the logic very clear, right? Only after you've identified the logic would weakening it clear. So then, once you identify the logic, think of how weakening would sound. Therefore, X, Y, Z, and then go through the. This is a previous year's question I've chosen for a reason. Please get started. All right. Uh, has anyone typed in the answer yet? No. Wait for a minute more. All right. Let me start with a question. I think ample time has been given. Some of you have answered it already. And let's get started. First is we have to get through the passage and figure out the logic of the above passage. We are told as information on air warfare tasks and stressors was being gathered, scenarios were being developed. A parallel effort ensued to identify test bed simulation for air warfare. The first, the reading process, we have to reread sentences several times sometimes. The first sentence probably has to be read twice by most students. We realize that the author is talking about a way to create simulation for air warfare teams to maintain experimental control. So we're trying to create a simulation, a training exercise for air warfare teams. So author then recommends a certain kind of training exercise to us. This long sentence. I've discussed this before, by the way. Let me just quickly mention it. The way to figure out whether to solve a passage or not, or to solve a question or not, should be based on the average length of sentences, and words, and new concepts. This, by the way, would qualify for all of those factors. It's a difficult question, but that is a difficult exam. Uh, Here we are told that uh, an exercise has to be designed, and this exercise has certain parameters that we have to apply. That a low physical fidelity simulation was acceptable. Now, again, suppose you don't know the meaning of the word fidelity. You try and solve the question accurately without knowing its meaning. A low physical simulation is acceptable. So one parameter is about the physicality of the experiment. The second parameter is about cognitive something has to be maintained. So the mental aspect of the experiment, that level has to be maintained. The physical level can be lower. So we have estimated the meaning of the word fidelity, which is some kind of level. The actual word would mean accuracy. Fidelity would mean accuracy. But we can also estimate its meaning by the process that I described. Okay, so parameter one is this low physical. Parameter two is cognitive, needs to be maintained. And the objective for parameter three is that soldiers should be able to, in a pressure situation, under pressure situation, soldiers should be able to maintain naturalistic decision making. Right? So these words marked in green are the logic of the above passage. The logic is that if you want to train air warfare teams, mark that in yellow. If you want to train the air warfare teams, then you have to do what is stated in those green uh, blanks that I've marked. Right. So to weaken this logic would be we need some option which will say that low physical fidelity is not a good idea, or maybe it cannot be done, or cognitive fidelity maintaining is not a good idea, or maybe it cannot be done, or under pressure situations maintaining naturalistic decision making is not a good idea, or it cannot be done. We are looking for some option to say that, and that kind of option would weaken the logic of the above passage. If I was to give everyone, let's say, 15 seconds, tell me which options would be strengthening. Are there, you can tell me the number, are there any specific statements which would strengthen the logic of the author? And that's why I chose this question. Which of these statements would strengthen the logic of the author? Let me see if someone has. All right. I percentile and other things can be discussed with someone else. I don't have the time frame for it right now. I'm really sorry. I need to tell you three things from this question. There are statements which are strengthening, there are statements which are weakening, and there is one statement which is unrelated to the logic of the above passage. Uh, I've explained the initial part. Let's start with statement five. Officers, when shortlisting soldiers for critical operations, pick up battle hardened soldiers rather than those who have been trained through simulations. So, is option five strengthening, weakening, or neutral? Option five would be neutral or unrelated because it's comparing simulation trained soldiers to experienced soldiers. The passage is trying to tell us how to train someone. We are not discussing between experience and training which is better. Option 5 is telling us experience is better than training. We want an option which will say the kind of training recommended by the author in the passage here is not going to work, or that would not suffice. Correct? So it's not training versus experience, but training versus possibly some other form of training. That is what is being discussed. In short, statement 5 is unrelated. Then there's statement 4. Statement 4, many students end up thinking is actually, let me just, many students end up thinking that statement 4 is actually weakening the author's argument. But if you notice, statement 4 says studies have shown simulated exercises for armed forces personnel have tended to induce a systematic type of correct and common behavior among the trainees. So, exercises for armed forces personnel will induce a systematic type of behavior. Correct? Exercise can have a systemic type of behavior. And what is the passage trying to do here? The passage is trying to create an exercise, a simulation exercise, so that soldiers, specific word which says soldiers somewhere. Yes, soldiers. So, air training exercise where soldiers can maintain naturalistic decision making. So, a group of people can think in a certain way. If you notice, sentence option 4 says a group of people can have a systematic type of behavior. So, statement 4 actually confirms the idea that a training exercise like this can actually be beneficial. So, statement 4 would be strengthening. Statement 5 would be neutral or unrelated. Statement 3 says numerous studies have shown that simulated environments can be designed to be good substitutes for real life combat situations. So, training is a good substitute. So, most students know that 3 is strengthening the author's argument. It's statements 1 and 2 that are weakening the author's argument. One says that high level of physical stress leads to weakening of decision making capabilities. Uh, Sentence 1 is a little tricky, so please pay attention. The passage says that if you want to create a air training exercise, if you want to simulate an air training exercise, you should choose a low physical stress situation was acceptable. Correct? A low physical stress situation was acceptable. But according to statement 1, it's under high stress that people's decision making capabilities get affected. So if it's under high stress that their decision making capabilities get affected, that means checking in a low stress situation is not beneficial. It's actually not testing. It's not a good test. It's like saying for studying for the XAT exam, I solved reading comprehensions from 10th standard. It's not going to work, right? You need, for a high stress situation, you need high stress training. So statement 1 is actually weakening the author's argument. Unrelated or neutral, strengthening, strengthening. Now, statement 2, it has been convincingly demonstrated by various studies that human beings by nature are not designed to adapt. So, this would mean no training is possible. No training possible. Just send them to war directly. Right? We have to accept it as true. So, 1 and 2 are both weakening the logic of the above passage. I spent a lot of time on the question, but I hope it will provide students with clarity. A good place to practice these questions is previous year CAT and XAT. These are the best area. GMAT questions are also useful, but a little slightly unrelated, sometimes harder. But previous year CAT and XAT papers are the best place. And enough questions you'll find. You'll find like at least 150, 200 odd questions. That's a lot of questions. If you look at RCs, you'll find even more questions of strengthening. All right. Now, let me quickly discuss inferences and assumptions. One is don't, no question is ever going to ask you, is A an inference or an assumption? Right? Is option A an inference or an assumption? This is never going to be asked. So try and not to think of these as, flashing in your mind. Try and separate them in your mind. I'll also give you examples for each. Inference is basically a conclusion, most plausible conclusion, implication, so on and so forth. So please note these down. Let's say A plus B gives us C. Here, A is a piece of evidence. We step outside our home, suppose right now, and we find water in the streets, right? In the other fact we notice when we step outside our houses, we see dark clouds in the sky. And using these two facts, we infer, this is a common everyday inference that all of us make. We infer that it has rained in the past, just before it has rained. Right? This is what an inference is. An inference is us putting together one or more facts to come up with a new but related fact. So we have actually come up with something new, and it's a related fact. Now, students will often ask, ki, sometimes inferences are directly mentioned in the passage. That's true. Some options are created like that. But by definition, an inference means that we need a piece of evidence or more to come up with that conclusion. All right. Let's look at assumptions. Assumptions are the example for assumptions would be A tells B, go to the market, buy vegetables. Now, a valid assumption would be usually, I get time to discuss these really slowly, but I actually want to show you some questions. So, valid assumption here would be one of the valid assumptions would be B knows the way to the market. B knows the way to the market is a valid assumption. Okay. Now, the reason why it's a valid assumption is the original, let's call this a passage. The original passage in this case tells us that A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. This is the piece of evidence that I needed for the assumption to be true, right? This piece of evidence tells me B knows the way to the market. What I want you to remember about assumption questions is an assumption, this is necessary. Let me write it in another color, and I want all of you to note it. A valid assumption is necessary for passage to be true. Valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. So what that means is, let's look at the statement again. A tells B, go to the market and buy vegetables. If I say B does not know the way to the market, B does not know the way to the market, then the original passage or original statement stops making sense. Right? So a valid assumption, if you find, let's say, out of four options, you think option D is your assumption, the way to check is a valid assumption is necessary for the passage to be true. So all you need to do is add the words does not and check if it destroys or if it negates the original passage. And if that's the case, that's your answer. Again, I know I've rushed through these definitions, but please later go through this and sort of pause the video and listen to what I'm saying carefully. Let's start with this 2011 question. This is an inference question. Please get started. Just a moment, please. Hmm. All right. Let's get started with this question. The above statements imply the following except. Any answers? I haven't found anyone who's given the answer yet. It's not a long passage, so I expect all of you all to have uh, some kind of clarity. Okay. So first, let's read the passage. Randomness has to be dealt with has to be dealt with successfully to ensure a better control over one's life. Before one can deal effectively with randomness, one must acknowledge its existence. So first, we have to acknowledge its existence. So step one, acknowledge randomness. Then step two, deal with randomness. And then maybe step three, which is better control over life. Right? So it's three steps. First step is acknowledge randomness. Second step is deal with randomness. And then if we can deal with randomness, then the third step, which is better control over one's life. So there are four options which are valid implications. There is one invalid implication, that exception. We need to identify that invalid inference. So we are looking for, there are four valid inferences or implications, one invalid inference. That's what we are looking for. Randomness can be dealt with effectively. So this is how we have to deal with inference questions in RCs or in critical reasoning. Now I start looking for this evidence. If I find evidence for this entire statement, word by word by word by word, and we know randomness can be dealt with effectively is a subset of this information. Right? So A is a valid inference. Now let's look at C. One can deal effectively with randomness if and only if one acknowledges its existence. So this is a rewording or a subset of this sentence. Before one can deal effectively with randomness, one must, if and only if is coming from the word must, which is mentioned in the passage. So if you remember, we needed to infer that it has rained outside. We needed two pieces of evidence. Here, we need this piece of evidence to say if and only if. Option C is a valid inference. So these are valid inferences, they're not our answers. Option E, if one does not acknowledge the existence of randomness, one cannot deal with it effectively. Again, the same sentence, again, same as option C, a different way to word option C. Option C, E, and A are valid inferences. These are not our answers. Now, everyone lives in a random world. Now, everyone lives in a random world. Also, the world has randomness in it, right? So, randomness has to be dealt with successfully to ensure better control over life. So, the author is associating, and we have to base our answer based on what the author is saying. The author is associating these two concepts, life and randomness, as related, right? Before one can effectively deal with randomness, one must acknowledge its existence. The other word that we repeatedly see in the passage is one, right? Better control over one's life. One must exercise, one must take care of their health. One must, we read this word all the time. So when we read that word, that's applicable to whoever is reading it, everyone in general. So option D is a valid inference as well. Everyone lives in a random world is a valid inference. All of these are valid inferences. The invalid inference here would be if one acknowledges the existence of randomness, one will be able to deal with it effectively. Right? Here, will be able to deal with it effectively is invalid because we don't have any evidence for it. Randomness has to be dealt with, meaning this could be X cannot deal with randomness and Y can deal with randomness and Z. So for different people, the capacity to deal with the randomness would be different. So one will be able to deal with it tells us that any person would be able to deal with randomness. And that is not stated by the passage, right? So this one word makes option B an invalid inference. So this, it's literally, you can look at this question like it's making sure we know how to search for this one word. Right? We have the ability to identify this specific one word. All right. Just a moment. Okay. All right. So there are more questions left, but I actually want to solve just one more question and then bring the class to an end. So please get started with question 6, which is an assumption question. This is a 2018 assumption question. There are 4 valid assumptions here and 1 invalid assumption. Please get started. All right. Actually, this is the exact amount of time that one does have in the exam. I gave you 2 minutes for this. Uh, let's start with this question. One moment. Right. Let me get started with this. There are 4 assumptions in this which are invalid, and one would be, sorry, 4 assumptions in this which are valid, and one would be an invalid assumption. We're looking for something which is not necessarily the underlying assumption. Again, a question that I chose specifically to those of you who are, just joining the session, please go back to what I've said in the just a few minutes about assumptions. This is very important for you to get better at the question type. So we'll go through the passage first. We are told about how there are dense roads in Lagos, and the air is full of trees, and it's a great West African city, and you'll find everything has dust and like icing on the cakes. There's thick grime everywhere. It's polluted, bedraggled, unhealthy. This has only been made possible by the exploitation of Africa's people. So clearly, the author is saying African people have been exploited. This week, 5 West African countries announced plans to end practice of European oil companies exporting African quality diesel. So exploitation of Africa is through European oil companies exporting African quality diesel to them. Uh, Dirty fuel has higher sulfur levels, and African quality fuel is not fit for European humans. So there's an element of racism there. And also, we are told that this is clearly causing Lagos to have terrible air. Right? We're looking for an invalid assumption. That means there are four valid assumptions. The test I told you for a valid assumption is to add the word not to it. If you add the word not to the valid assumption, it will invalidate the original passage. I know that sounds like a word salad, but you know, just- we'll try and apply this to each option and it will become clear to you. African nations had accepted dirty fuel as the norm. Right? So we are told African nations have accepted dirty fuel as a common practice. If you, firstly, this is clearly something that is prevalent in Lagos, and it's a problem which has lasted for a while. The other thing is that in the second half of the passage, after telling us that this problem is there, we are told this week five West African countries XYZ decided to end the practice of European oil companies exporting African quality diesel. It's called, the term also has become common. So we are told that African nations had this kind of fuel for quite a bit of time. In fact, it's not even all African countries, just five West African countries are doing this. So African nations had accepted dirty fuel as the norm is a valid underlying assumption. If I said African nations had not accepted dirty fuel as the norm, then this bit, all these pieces of information that I discussed would be invalidated. So E is a valid assumption checked by using this not test. Please keep this in mind. This is going to help you with assumption questions in the exam. Let's try this with D. Typically, African cities today are not fit for human habitation. So we are told it's considered not fit for, in this case, racist outlook wise European Union, but generally this quality fuel is not fit for humans. So that means African cities today are not fit for human habitation. This is quite possibly a valid assumption. If I say are fit for human habitation, if I remove the word not, then this bit of the passage stops making sense. All right, so we'll consider these as valid assumptions. Let's look at A. European oil companies dump their fuel on African countries, uh, announce plans to end the practice of them dumping this fuel. So clearly, this is a valid assumption. If I said don't dump, then this plans to end would stop making sense. So A is an invalid assumption, is a valid assumption as well. So these are not our answers so far. We are looking for an invalid assumption. Let's look at B, economic exploitation until challenge runs smoothly. Now, B is actually a generalization. This is we just have one example of these African cities and this issue of oil. We can't generalize this and say this applies to everything. So we'll put B aside. B looks like it could be a problematic option. It's saying that this applies to everything. Let's look at C. Racism makes it easy for Europeans to justify the exploitation of inferior races. So, a few problems here. One is racism makes it easy, although there is racism, makes it easy. We don't know if it actually makes it easy because it's not like they are trying to justify giving bad oil, saying because we are a better race, they're probably giving it based on some demand supply thing. It's not like they're publicly justifying this. The other thing is inferior races is a generalization. So which generalization would be more acceptable here, B or C? Here, if you notice, racism makes it easy, more problem to justify. There's no such justification from the European countries as uh, race is the reason why race is why you're getting bad fuel. This justification has not been made, and inferior races is a generalization. This applies to African nations in passage. So option C is not necessarily a valid assumption. B, if I say economic exploitation until challenge does not run smoothly, or economic exploitation always comes to an end by the, I know this is longer, but it'll be clear, by the exploiters choosing to stop. This would be invalid, right? This is opposite of what is stated in the passage. In the passage, we are told that the exploiters are forced to stop by the African nations. So C is the right choice here. All right. So I'm way beyond the timeline. I need to actually bring the class to an end. I have discussed all these questions in a lot of detail. There are some questions that I could not address today, so please leave those questions in the comment section. I'm going to find some way to get those addressed to you really quickly. So make sure to leave your answers in the comment section. I'll bring the class to an end. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.